Hi, I'm Selena Lovett from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Johanna Taylor, who is a graphic novel author, but she's mainly an illustrator and an artist. And her first book is coming out or is out. Is it
It's
out yet?
coming out in July. July 23rd is the
That's
launch
what I
date.
thought. Okay. And for readers unfamiliar with your work, how would you describe what it is you write? And could you explain a little bit more about your book?
Yeah, so for those unaware, my debut graphic novel that I wrote and drew is called The Ghost Keeper. It's a Victorian fantasy with a little bit of horror mixed in, and it's about a guy who's a therapist for ghosts. And so he goes around to haunted houses and just instead of exorcising the ghosts or getting rid of them, he just kind of sits them down and asks them about their problems and why they're haunting the house they're haunting. And it's supposed to be a really lighthearted and cozy story, but it also deals with some fairly heavy mental health themes. And honestly, that's what people can expect from me, from my writing. I am inspired a lot by mental health topics and mental illness and like coping in a very difficult and hostile environment and learning how to utilize a support system and using fairly basic therapy techniques to be able to cope and be able to find peace in a place where it's really difficult to find peace naturally. And so I love a lot of fantasy. I like to inject a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of magical realism, and this time around it's Victorian, which has been really fun because Victorians are famously very closed off emotionally about mental health topics, and so I felt like that was an appropriate setting for my story to kind of explore these topics in an environment where that would be a little bit more quiet, a little bit more restrictive and emotionally closed off. But yeah, you can expect a lot of ghosts, just so many ghosts in this book, arguably too many. And I like doing equal parts like cozy and darker and heavier themes, but approached in a way that kind of makes people feel like they're being heard and things that feel a little bit kind and soft and kind of like the book equivalent of an old friend sitting down and giving you a hug and helping you to deal with something that's really difficult. And in my book, you get it from the perspective of a child character, Lucy, who is a ghost, and you get it from the perspective of an adult character, Dorian, and you kind of see the contrasts of how they're both able to cope with similar issues and kind of talks to both demographics simultaneously.
Okay, so who is this graphic novel aimed towards mostly?
So primarily it's a YA, young adult. It's because the protagonist is a little older. He's about 20, 21 years old. But there are many characters in the story that are, for example, there's a grandmother character who's also a ghost. There's a young girl who's about 9 years old and she's a ghost too. And they each kind of have their own difficulties and trials that they're working through. So really, this particular book is very much for anyone. I think anyone of any age will be able to find something in this book that they can relate to. But primarily in terms of subject and the type of story that I'm telling and the point of view character, aka the protagonist, it's a young adult and generally from the ages of about 12 to 17 years old is the official demographic, but really it's for anyone.
Okay, so what do you think would draw readers to this book or to these kinds of books?
I think anyone who's interested in mental health subject matter, I really like to explore experiences that deal with psychology and deal with what people are experiencing on a mental health level. And I think anybody it feels like it's more discussed more openly today, mental health, than any other time in history,
Mm.
which is really cool, but it's also creating a lot of questions that younger readers are asking about, is what I'm experiencing normal? How do I cope with death? How do I cope with grief? How do I cope with change in a way that's inviting a conversation to happen? And so I think anybody who is looking to find personal peace and answers to how to cope with their current situation will be drawn to stories like this that have fairly open conversations and try to destigmatize and just address what people feel rather than trying to adopt a mentality of just figure it out yourself, you're weak if you can't, et cetera, et cetera. So really, I think anybody who likes the idea of exploring their mental health and also is interested in the medium of graphic novels, because the visual element combined with the narrative element helps create a safe degree of separation between people and what they're experiencing in a way that's pretty unique. And it's really exciting to see graphic novels taking on a more, not necessarily autobiographical in my story's case, though that does happen in graphic novels as a medium. But it's really cool to see those opportunities for those stories to be told to people where they can kind of let their guard down and experience what they're experiencing through another person and another character's viewpoint, but also have that visual element of really capturing how they feel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And the name of your book again is
It's called The Ghost Keeper.
The Ghost Keeper. Yes. Okay. Um, what exactly was the inspiration for this particular book?
So this particular book is based very heavily on I don't know if you've heard of Oscar Wilde's The Canterville Ghost or if you've read it, but it's Oscar Wilde is one of my favorite authors. He is a mess as a person, but I love his work.
Yes.
But the Canterville Ghost, for those who are not familiar, is a story about a ghost who's haunting this manor house, and a new family moves in, and this ghost is trying so hard to scare this family out of the manor he's stuck in, and everything he tries just does not work. He is arguably very, very bad at haunting. And all of the children, like, they kind of laugh at him. They don't really take him seriously. And he's trying to be really scary and he's trying to be this fearsome haunt in their house. And they'll just kind of make jokes about him and completely miss the point of his fearsome, intimidating presence. And eventually he just breaks down and gets really upset and like takes it personally that he can't scare this family. And it kind of turns into a little mini therapy session, or as close as to a therapy session as a book written in the 1800s can get, right? And that, and as well as stories like The Sixth Sense and The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, just a very frank and kind of tongue-in-cheek relationship between the living and the dead, where they're just kind of chatting with each other and they're relating their experiences to each other and really coming to the realization that somebody in the 1700s or the 1800s had similar fears and worries as somebody might today. You know, how everything we go through is kind of cyclical and kind of generational in terms of how like it's the same issues, but with a different skin and different context and different environmental factors. But at the very core, we all have something that we can learn from each other, whether living or dead. And also, my mom is a therapist. That's what she does for work. She's a licensed LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. And I took a lot of inspiration from the work that she does with her clients, and I've always been interested in mental health topics. And I thought it would be kind of a fun twist to really focus on the therapy part of, oh, isn't it funny that this guy talks to ghosts and treats them like he would a patient in a therapist's office, because ghosts famously have a lot of problems and a lot of unresolved tension, because that's why, arguably, why they're here and why they interact with the living is because they have unresolved regrets or issues or frustrations that are keeping them bound to the mortal plane, as it were.
Okay. Now, how much research did you have to do for this book?
Um, I did a decent amount of research, mostly from the therapy side of things. My
Right.
mom had just folders and folders full of notes about dealing with certain mental health topics, particularly revolving around PTSD and coping with grief and loss and death, just in the context of your family unit, and especially dealing with change and any sort of maladaptive situation where somebody might not be able to move forward or might be stuck in old habits. And I also researched a lot into cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the idea that the true change within yourself starts with your thoughts, and recognizing certain distortions that you kind of create in your mind based on what you've experienced in the past and how that translates into your interactions with the world around you, and how that informs your ability to form relationships. So I did a lot of research on that, and I actually had a really cool opportunity to go on a research trip to Scotland while I was writing this graphic novel. And I mean, a friend of mine had gotten into the Fringe Festival with a play that she wrote. And so I decided that was a great opportunity to go and support her. But also, my story is heavily influenced by the aesthetic of Edinburgh specifically. And so I got to go to Edinburgh and just take a bunch of photos, and that helped inform the architecture that I put in the graphic novel, and just a lot of the visual aesthetic and the settings of the book were informed by the photos I took in Edinburgh and London, and it was really exciting.
Did you have to do any or a lot of research about the time period?
I did do research about the time period. The nice thing was, this wasn't meant to be completely historically accurate, but I was able to do some research so that it would create a believable, like, Victorian analog, because it's still a fantasy story, more or
Mhm.
less. Like, the town isn't called Edinburgh, all of the names and all of the places aren't real places, they're just based on real places. But I did do some research in terms of how people dressed, and how people what kind of jobs they had, and what kind of diseases and illnesses and environmental factors that influenced how they lived. I also went to the in while I was in London, I went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which it's basically a Victorian era specific museum, and it had all kinds of things like desks and chairs and tables and outfits. And so a lot of my research in the time period was visual and aesthetic based. And so you'll see a lot of what I drew and created for the graphic novel art wise. Those props that you'll see in the graphic novel are heavily based on what I saw in the museum and what I saw throughout my research.
So when you were creating the graphic novel, did you do your artwork first, or did you mostly write the words, or did they really all kind of blend together?
Um, it's interesting because a lot of graphic novelists, they have very different approaches from each other. For me, I'm a very paneling and composition heavy artist. It for me the staging comes first of like, okay, what's happening in this panel? How does this transition to the rest of the story? What little clues can I leave that either foreshadow what's coming later, or how can I create this page in a way that's visually interesting to look at? So I did the art and the writing kind of simultaneously. So I would write a page of the script, and as I went, I would have these ideas for certain panel layouts. And another part of my research that I didn't mention before is I just read a ton of comics and graphic novels and just kind of got some ideas of how other people approached their panel compositions. And so I just would make little notes I would have a sketchbook nearby and I would be writing on like an online document. And I would kind of make a note of which page it was and do a little thumbnail of what I was thinking for the panel composition and just what seemed interesting to me. So I kind of did it at the same time. But when it comes to what the editor asked for, I delivered a script of the graphic novel, just a full kind of a screenplay like
Mm.
script. And I would send it over to the editor. And then while I was waiting for feedback, I would start working on thumbnails for the graphic novel and trying to figure out how to compose it in a comics way and translate what I'd written in the script to the page. So it was almost like I did two rough drafts. I did a rough draft of the words and then a rough draft of the art. And then from there, I got feedback and was able to refine things. But yeah, it's a very intensive process. So I guess the short version of that answer would be I did kind of both at the same time.
Okay. So did you have a full outline or an idea of the whole story before you um
Yes.
did it? Okay, so you're more of an outliner than a seat of your pants writer.
Yes. Yes, I need to have an outline. I struggle a lot with when I don't have an idea like written down in front of me. If I don't know how something ends, I really struggle with trying to connect the dots. But as far as dialogue, like writing dialogue, I'm very much a seat of my pants writer. Like I
Okay.
will take a scene and just be like, okay, where does this go? And I just kind of write out, I don't even write out descriptions for the panels. I just write out so and so says this, so and so replies with that, so and so replies with that. And then kind of take the scene as far as it interests me or until it accomplishes what I want it to accomplish. And then I go back and put in the panel descriptions later and break it up into pages and see where things kind of fit and make sense.
Which did you find was harder, the artwork or the writing?
Oh, the writing, 100%. Because I've done a lot of work in terms of my education was primarily learning how to do art. I went to school for animation, and so a lot of what I learned was how to draw, how to illustrate, but also the storytelling aspect of storyboarding. I minored in storyboarding when I was in art school, so I learned a lot about what makes a compelling composition, what makes a compelling shot for film and for TV. And there was quite a bit of overlap, actually. I was able to take the things I learned from storyboarding and kind of translate it to a degree into onto the page, albeit in a much more streamlined way than storyboarding takes. But as far as the writing part of it, I had way less experience directly than I did with the art. So although the art took longer than the writing was a lot more difficult for me personally because I was kind of having to learn to write on the fly in a lot of ways. So I was having to read a lot of comics, read a lot of books, see what other people did, and kind of internally sponge as much inspiration as I could. Whereas with the art, I felt like I was a little bit more prepared, even though I hadn't really done a proper graphic novel or a comic before The Ghost Keeper. I was able to kind of figure it out on the go a little bit easier because I knew the fundamentals of drawing. I knew the fundamentals of creating a composition and an illustration that looks good and is compelling to readers. But I had about 10 or 15 more art classes than I had writing classes.
Okay.
Like I took one creative writing class when I was at school and it was great. It was very helpful, but that was several years ago.
So what's the difference between storyboarding and and a graphic novel and writing a comic book or whatever?
Way less panels. So usually in storyboarding, you'll have several panels kind of in succession where it's like character does this pose, then they do this pose, then they have this reaction, then they have that reaction. And basically it's counting all of the shots that a camera would have, but it's also counting the shots within the shots. So if a character goes from emotion A to emotion B, those are two separate panels and two separate things that you would see in a storyboard. Whereas in a comic, you've only got about 200, 300 pages to tell your story. And really, each panel is confined to only one thing can happen per panel, per character. And so you're cutting out a lot of the extra panels that would generally go into a storyboard. And you're having to learn a lot about keeping things concise on the storytelling front and being very, very efficient with how you use your space. Because the longer the book gets, the more expensive it is to print, the harder it is to keep the attention of the reader, depending on the type of story that you're telling. So those are the primary differences. And I'm sure some storyboarders can correct me if they'd like, but primarily it's just a matter of taking thousands of drawings because storyboards are thousands of drawings. Like they're a very intensive and also don't have to be super detailed. They're basically a rough draft for the cinematographer of it looks like this and then they do this and then they do this and this is how it's going to look from a camera perspective. Whereas with a graphic novel, there is some degree of finish you need to apply to each panel, but also you don't get that many thousands of drawings. You probably get 1,000 drawings, but most of what you draw, you have to accommodate for room for speech bubbles as well. And that's usually something that you don't have to worry about with a storyboard because with
Yeah.
storyboarding, the dialogue comes through with audio, with voice acting, and you don't have to, aside from little subtitles on the bottom, you don't have to really worry about that space. But with graphic novels, and that was something that I didn't really realize until I started roughing in the thumbnails, was a lot of the artwork gets covered up by speech bubbles and you have to word things in a way that's concise enough that will fit the speech bubble. And that was really difficult for me because I'm a very verbose person. And when I write, I tend to be very long-winded. And so it was a kind of crucible of learning to be concise, learning to use small words as often as possible and be very careful and selective about how many big words I used. Whereas with prose writing and with storyboarding, that's not really something you have to worry about as much. But with comics, you have to be very intentional about how you phrase things. Otherwise,
Mm.
it's just not going to fit.
So was that the biggest challenge that you had in writing and putting out the book, or
I would
how
say
did you
so.
overcome that? How did you overcome the challenge?
Oh gosh, honestly, a lot of it came down to just reading a bunch of comics, seeing what other people did, and seeing what they were able to get away with and trying to apply that to my own story. And honestly, that was difficult. That was hard because of my penchant for being very long-winded, just to kind of cut things down because I'd never had to think about that before. I'd never had to think about, okay, the bubble can only be this big, so I can only write like 5 or 6 words to fit in there, otherwise it's going to cover the characters. And really what helped me overcome it was mostly just practice and kind of getting into a rhythm of figuring out, okay, this is generally how long a stretch of dialogue needs to be unless it's exposition, and then kind of planning the art around that and incorporating the speech bubbles into the thumbnailing process. So in my thumbnails, I would straight up have circles, just blank circles posted all over the compositions, kind of to give myself a rough draft idea of this is where the this is where the dialogue is going to go, and to also give my letterer a rough draft of this is where I'd like you to put the dialogue. But yeah, I think the practice of me kind of pre-putting in the circle of this is generally where the dialogue would go. Now let's draw the characters helped me overcome that a little bit more.
Did you have to decide? Did you decide where the dialogue went, or
Mhm.
did? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I decided where the dialogue went, and I even so my thumbnail process is a little bit different in that it's a lot more detailed than a lot of comic artists will do. A lot of times you'll see just stick figures and scribbles, and for me, if I draw that way and then have to leave the project and come back to it, it just breaks my brain. I'm like, I have no idea what I was trying to say there. And so I actually typed in placeholder dialogue right in my drawing app and just stuck it there. And so and my characters were fairly detailed. So it was almost combining the thumbnail and the pencil stage into one, which, takes a little longer, arguably too long for how much you end up having to change. But for me, that was the approach that helped because it really helped me to solidify where the dialogue could go and how much I could say in terms of wording and in terms of trying to get the point across with the words that I chose.
Okay. So in the Ghost Keeper, who was your favorite character? Which character did you love or hate the most,
In
or
terms
both?
of writing or in terms of the character
The
as a
characters,
person?
the character as a person.
Oh, I mean, I really I really liked Dorian. Like Dorian was fun to write because a lot of what he experienced was analogous to things that I'd experienced in the past. Like some of the dialogue was taken directly from conversations I'd had with people, which was kind of it was kind of cool in to insert little moments from my life where it's like this actually happened to me and being able to put that directly into the story. And also he and I just are very similar people Like, we try to take up as little space as possible. We're very accommodating. We try really hard to placate other people, and usually to the detriment of our own health. And that's part of why self-care is such a huge element of the story, and learning how to be able to take care of yourself as well as others, because that was just something that really resonated with me, and that made Dorian a character that was very easy to write, but also felt very cathartic to write through the voice of. And also, funny enough, Connell, he's a terrible person, but he was really fun to write too, because a lot of what he said kind of was delivered through the styling of a classic villain monologue, which I'm a huge fan of. I love a good villain monologue. I love a good kind of like villainous speech, in a way that's very, here's why the world is messed up and why you should do things the way I do it, but with a little bit less mustache twirling in this version, obviously. But it was really fun to get into that headspace of this is why the world is broken, and being able to kind of talk through that. That was also cathartic in its own way.
Oh, okay. So what else can we expect from you in the near future?
Oh gosh. A lot more comics. I'm contributing a lot more short form comics into anthologies because comics takes a while. So I'm working on a pitch with a friend of mine who's going to be the she's going to be the writer, and I'm doing the art for it. And that is on submission currently. So fingers crossed, we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, yeah, I'm doing shorter form comics, probably like 8 to 10 page tops for various anthologies, and hoping to just do smaller one-off comics just for fun, because again, it is so much work to do the writing and the art as just one person. And so I'm focusing a lot more on having other people write the story and me draw and do the art. And then with the ones that I write and draw myself, keeping to a little bit of a shorter format. Of course, I say that, but I've also got like long form graphic novel pitches in the works that I wrote and drew myself because I'm a glutton for punishment. So,
Okay,
yeah.
that sounds great. All right, now I have questions about being a writer. Um,
Okay.
and actually, I've got two questions. One is about your favorite part about being a writer and your
Mhm.
favorite part about being an artist.
Oh boy, this is tricky because I still haven't quite gotten to the place where I really like writing. Like, I'm still in the growing pains of this is really hard. I'm honing a craft that I haven't really honed before. And so a lot of my writing process is just kind of staring at an empty page and willing myself to do the work. And then somehow by sheer divine providence, the words just show up on the page. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, how did I do that? And so I would say my favorite part of being a writer is imagining the scenes in my head, kind of playing out like I'm watching a movie, and being able to transfer that onto a page so it doesn't just live in my head in perpetuity, right? I like that part of it, but I also like when I'm able to get out of my fears and my insecurities, because I think that's a big part of why I don't enjoy writing in a traditional sense, is because it's still so new to me that I get really caught up in what if it's bad? What if I show it to somebody and they give me feedback? Heaven forbid, What if it's not perfect on the first try? And so I get to a place where I get so wrapped up in the insecurity of it and in the fear of, oh, people have such high expectations and what if I let them down? And it's like, this is literally your first draft. Nobody's expecting anything. And so I think getting to a place where I'm experiencing the flow state and I get out of my head and I am able to just write down write down the words, write down the scenes, and I feel like once I hit that, that helps a lot. And then I feel like, "Oh, this is actually fun," you know? So I would say once I can push through to get to that part, that is my favorite part of being a writer.
Okay, what about artist?
Um, I really like the thumbnail process because it's the first step of this only exists in my head to this is something that I can show people and they can see how it's supposed to play out and they can capture a general vibe and a kind of a vector through which the story is told. And I also really like being able to design characters and have them like my style skews a little bit more stylistic and more kind of, I mean, cartoony, but I don't know. I go back and forth on the term cartoony because sometimes it can feel reductive, but you get what I mean. Like their faces can be kind of exaggerated, their reactions can be a little bit, an animated TV show type of a situation where they're not very static. They're always moving, they have poses that are dynamic, and they have really big reactions to things, and the way they look in panel is very intentionally they're very intentional decisions. And I really like the dynamism, and that's where I kind of inject a little bit of my animation background in there is I love kind of creating dynamic poses and creating situations where you can look at a character and know exactly how they're feeling and be able to tell by their body language and by the way they're sitting, by the way they're standing, by the look on their face, you know exactly how they're feeling. And that is so important in comics to be able to deliver that right out the gate. I mean, the dialogue helps, but it is very important to be very intentional and be very pushed with how you pose the character, how their expression reflects what they're feeling. There's a very potent link, like an emotional link there. And so I would say that's my favorite part. Like characters are just a lot of fun.
Okay. Um, what has been your favorite adventure during your career?
My favorite adventure. Um, honestly, the fact that I have a career at all has been kind of an adventure. Because there's so much about the art and comics and publishing industry that it feels like every time you do something or are involved, they completely change the rules on you and they completely change how things work. They change their expectations. And so you walk in and it's almost as though you can't expect anything because something's going to be different from what you were told. And so I found that the biggest adventure has largely been getting here because so much of it was just the most random, fortuitous, knew somebody who told somebody else, who found somebody else, who had this thing that they wanted, and being in the right place at the right time, but also being prepared to a degree while in the right place at the right time. I don't know, this is kind of a nonsense answer, but just looking back, it's been really interesting because my publishing career started in 2020. Like, and I was a colorist for graphic novels. I was nowhere near creating my own story. And then suddenly there was a pitch event on Twitter where they were asking for, hey, we want it's hashtag DVPit, which I believe the DV stands for diverse voices. But there was an editor who created that pitching event, and they said, okay, for this one day, we're going to have everybody who wants to write prose novels or create comics, if you fall under these marginalized categories of like person of color, queer person, disabled, etc., we want to see your pitches, and we're going to have agents, literary agents, looking through the tag to see if they like anything. And so just on a whim, I was like, well, I'm a queer person. I have this story that's very much about mental health and that sort of thing. It's got a queer protagonist, and it was just kind of been bouncing around my head. You know what? Why not? Why not? Let's just try it. That just sounds like an interesting thing. And that was how I got my agent.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a very bizarre and impossible to replicate process, and a lot of writing careers seem to kind of be like that. It's just a series of very fortuitous, lucky, random, unreplicatable little moments that kind of build up and create opportunities. And not even in a way to like discourage anyone from trying to be a writer or get into comics, but it's just fascinating because if I hadn't tried that one, if I hadn't followed that one fleeting moment of what if I tried this, then I wouldn't be here today talking to you, right?
Right.
And so I think the adventure really is in keeping an open mind and just being willing to try whatever. Just like if you have an idea, if you have this opportunity that's presented to you, just go for it, because you literally never know where that's going to go. And that is kind of adventure enough for me as an introvert who is very much like, I'm a homebody, I'm fairly sedentary, I don't need a ton of excitement in my life, but just the chance that you get to try things and to like write that story, submit that thing. The worst thing they could say is no. And if it works out, then that creates the adventure.
Okay. So my next question, you sort of might have just answered it, but what is the greatest lesson that you've learned in your
Um,
career?
I would say part of it is what I mentioned before, like the willingness to be spontaneous and to be quixotic in your approach of, oh, let's try this thing. Let's do this thing that you might not have thought of before and you might not have been had the courage to try before. Just kind of just do it. But also the greatest lesson that I've learned in comics is that it's extremely collaborative, even when it's just you doing the story and the art. And I didn't really understand that until I was in it, that art and writing aren't really done strictly by one person in a vacuum. There's a lot of there's a lot of support, there's a lot of people behind the scenes working to also make it a success. Like for example, I have a letterer who lettered the Ghost Keeper. His name's Micah Myers. He did a phenomenal job, and his decisions that he made with the lettering helped to elevate the story. And I had my editor, Chris Hernandez at Penguin, who helped kind of create the story and kind of solidify where things needed to be. And I also had developmental editors, Rachel White and Henry Glasheen. They both helped to give feedback and were very pivotal for the early development of the Ghost Keeper into something that's like, okay, this is kind of a mess, but I get what you were trying to say, and bringing it up to, okay, now everybody can understand what you're trying to say and everybody can relate to the message that you're getting across with this book. So I guess just not being afraid of the collaborative process and understanding that there are people out there, whether in your immediate support circle or who can be accessible in the community, who are willing to help. And having that not be a mark against your ability as a creator, and just accepting that this is how stories are told. Like we come together and we create something that can change lives, and it's doesn't have to be just you, you know?
Hmm. Very interesting. And is that the piece of advice that you would want to share with other writers, or do you have anything else that you want to add?
I would say that would be the thing that I would give as advice to other writers. Just don't be afraid to pursue any opportunity that you see, even if they seem like they might not be directly exactly what you wanted to do. And also, I would add on to that, just because it's the nature of the world that we're living in, that it's okay to pivot. If something's not working, it's okay to take a beat, try something else for a while, and that it's not a mark of failure on your part to have tried something and have it not succeed. Or if you're trying to make it full time as a writer and you just aren't able to make enough money doing it, it's okay to, get a day job or to do something else for a while to kind of build up your reserves, build up your savings, get back on your feet. If it feels like the opportunities aren't coming and it feels like you're not reaching the goals that you'd hoped that you would reach, that would be my more practical advice. So we've
Okay.
got the pie in the sky, like try everything, yay, life's an adventure, but also real talk, if things don't work out, it's okay to pivot, to kind of retreat, take a step back, reevaluate your approach, figure out what needs to change so that you can have a sustainable life, you know? Because unfortunately, this isn't the 80s anymore. You can't make comics and then buy a house with your comics money, Like that's not how things work anymore, unfortunately. And until you're able to get to a more stable position, it's completely okay. And nobody's going to take away your author card if you're not able to solely sustain yourself with your writing.
Great. Good advice. Okay. Are there any groups, clubs, or organizations that you that might have helped you in your career that you would recommend to other authors or
Yes.
artists?
Yes. So the Cartoonist Cooperative, I want to plug that. It's a cooperative of people who they exchange advice, they exchange feedback, they exchange resources in order to make sure that comics is being like equitably treated, like comic artists are being treated equitably by publishers, indie indie groups, and creating context for what it's supposed to be and what is a fair wage, what is not a fair wage, what is industry standard and what's not. They provide support with contracts, they provide support with art feedback, and they also will have little activities every so often and little workshops of here's how you pitch a comic, here's a little round table with some authors who have published books for people who are thinking about going into traditional publishing or indie publishing. Like the Cartoonist Cooperative is a really good resource, and I would recommend anyone interested in cartooning, comics, graphic novels, trad pub, indie pub, all of it. I would recommend that they apply and join the Cartoonist Cooperative.
Great. Okay. Now questions about you as a person. What is one thing that people don't realize about you?
Um, Gosh, that's a tough one because I feel like I'm a fairly open book on social media. I tend to talk fairly openly about like struggles with mental health, struggles with making it in the industry, and I tend not to sugarcoat things too much. But I would say that a lot of people don't realize that I'm a pretty introverted and cynical person in real life, because a lot of times they'll see me on social media and I try to be a very positive person on social media because I want to, when I put things out into the world, I want to put things out that are kind and uplifting and not just, oh, we're all doomed, everything is bad. And while there's a little bit of that, I try to really outweigh it by, hey, you're doing great, everything's fine, I'm proud of you. This is your social media comic mom telling you everything's gonna be okay and giving you a virtual hug, that sort of thing. But in real life, I'm pretty quiet, I'm pretty reserved, and I am fairly cynical, but I try to keep that side out of the social media sphere as much as I can. And also, like, a lot of people meet me at conventions, and when you're at a convention, you have to be on, as it were. And
Mm,
so I think
absolutely.
people think that I'm more extroverted than I am because when I'm at a con, I'm there to sell my work. You know, I'm there to make connections, I'm there to network, but also I I'm in a very loud environment and I feel like I need to be loud too in order to kind of survive in that situation. But then when I come home, like I spend most nights inside just reading and just reading comics with my cat and just having a comfy time with a mug of tea, you know. But yeah, I would say that would probably be the thing, though I don't know if that's something that they realize about me or not, just because I don't meet a ton of people from social media like in real life. I've also heard people say that I'm like shorter in real life than they think,
Okay.
which is funny because like I'm 5'6". It's like that's
I,
kind of a
that's not
regular
very short.
height. But yeah, there's something about me that make people think like, oh, I thought you'd be taller. And I'm like, I don't know, man.
Okay. You just answered kind of one of my other questions, which was a lot of artists or authors have furry, feathered, or otherwise non-human companions to help them with their work. And do you have any? And yes, you do. I can see one right next to
She's
you.
been hanging out off camera.
I see that.
She's been very good. Normally by this time in any sort of video call, she would just be like climbing over, rubbing her face against the computer screen and sitting in my lap and just being very loud.
And she's
But
doing great now.
she's doing great. Yeah, this is Raven. She just turned 5 last month, and
Oh,
she's a very soft, spooky girl. And usually she'll just sit in my lap when I'm drawing and she'll sit on my notes and kind of give her professional approval and her opinion of how things are. You want
does
to say
she,
hi?
so does she help or hinder you when you're
I think
working?
she helps. She reminds me to take breaks.
Yeah, and there she is now.
And here she is now. Yep. Oh, she got shy. But
Okay.
yeah, she's been a huge help because I do have a tendency to overwork and to do a little bit too much. And just at this and so she just kind of shows up and is like, it's time to take a break. And she just snuggles in and
Yeah,
loves to
animals tend
tries.
to do that. They
Yeah, yeah.
tend to
She'll
say,
like
you have to walk me, or you have to feed me, and you need to
hmm
take a break.
hmm Yeah, and she'll just start licking my face or she'll chew on my headphones. That's really the sign where I can tell she really wants me to stop what I'm doing and pay attention to her.
Hmm.
And also
Absolutely.
why I've stopped wearing headphones during Zoom interviews. Because she'll just chew on them and she'll yank them out of my ears. I'm just like, cat.
Yep.
Hmm.
So, what are your passions when you're not working, and how do you make time to do the things that you love?
Oh gosh, that's hard because there's a lot of overlap between my passions and what I do for work. Because like I draw for fun as well. And I also will occasionally make comics for fun as well. So there's a really fine line to hit there so that I don't get too burned out. And usually, what my pivoting looks like is spending time with friends, like going and hanging out with them, playing games with them. I'm also a huge gamer. I play video games. And so basically, it's like name a Nintendo game, and I've played it. But yeah, I really like to unwind. I unwind with video games, not so much anymore, or rather, I had to pivot to what kinds of video games I play because using my hands too much, it kind of creates some problems. I've had some repetitive strain injuries in the past from drawing too much. And so I have to be very careful about the hobbies that I pursue so that I'm not using my hands too intensively. So lately, I've been reading and cooking have been the big ones that I've been doing in terms of unwinding and giving myself a rest, and also hiking. I hike a lot and I swim. Swimming's been a recent one just because, therapeutically speaking, it's really good for my hands. It's a very good exercise. It's cardio and also provides resistance training that help with hand injuries and wrist injuries. So yeah, sorry, that answer was kind of all over the place, but it's tough because a lot of what I do in my free time conveniently is kind of also work. Like I read, but I'm also an author. So is that research or is that a hobby, you know?
Yeah, good point. Good point. So, what does your writing space look like, and what do you need to have around you when you're writing or um, drawing?
Hmm. So usually I have a mug of tea, usually a warm herbal tea. I really like fruit teas, but also since it's summer, I pivot a little bit more to iced tea. And I usually have water around and a sketchbook nearby so that I can take notes. And just in case I have an idea and I want to kind of like scribble something out. That was a really huge thing when I was writing Ghost Keeper. I just had an entire sketchbook and basically I didn't really draw anything in it. It was just notes and just little thumbnail sketches of just like, this is what I want to do for this page and this is what I want to do for that page. And so I think those are the big ones. And then just in general, I've got a Cintiq screen that's fairly large and it you draw on it with a little tablet pen. And so I always have this nearby in my space. And yeah, I'll usually keep reference books here too, just kind of on the side. I've got one that's pretty good in terms of it's called Draw Stronger by Creota Wilberg, and it teaches you about keeping good posture, some exercises to do for your hands. So usually I'll just kind of flip through it periodically and have it on hand. And if I'm working on a story that's very specific about an aesthetic or about a style that I want to emulate from a certain artist, I'll have a little stack of comics on my desk just to kind of flip through for reference. So that kind of sums it up. I have a lot on my desk.
Okay. And when you're working, do you listen to music or do you like silence? And if music, what kind?
Yeah, so I can only listen to video game soundtracks when I write. Yeah,
Okay.
I need stuff that doesn't have like words specifically. They need to be either kind of those fake lyrical languages that they create for video games, or it has to be completely instrumental. And some of my go-tos are the soundtracks from the Nier series, like Nier Gestalt, Nier Replicant, and Nier Automata, Shadow of the Colossus, Hollow Knight, Zelda, Studio Ghibli, so like Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, and Final Fantasy. And occasionally I'll do film soundtracks too, like Interstellar. Recently I was listening to a lot of the Crimson Peak soundtrack as well, for especially for it's fitting for a Victorian setting. But yeah, and when I do my art, then I transition to video essays, or I'll transition to music that has lyrics, or like podcasts, things like that.
Mhm. Okay. I just have two more questions for you. Where
Okay.
can people find your work or your books, or where will they be able to find your books? Your book. And aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and you can get Johanna's book at Annie's if you call us at 508-796-5613, or you can email us at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. And where else will people be able to get your book?
Oh goodness. I think it will be able to be found. I mean, obviously, the big box chains like Barnes and Noble and Amazon, they can be ordered online. They can be ordered through the Penguin Random House website. But in terms of physical copies, I think most indie bookstores, thanks to the Indies Introduce initiative through the American Book Association, American Booksellers Association, I think my book should be able to be found in most indie bookstores to some degree. I will also be at Fanex Salt Lake City in September, and I will be selling copies of those books, and I will be doing signings. Also, I have a book launch event happening in at the Printed Garden bookstore in Sandy, Utah, and there will be copies for sale. I'll stick around for a signing. There will be a live reading of the book. So for those of you who are in the Utah area, that could be something to check out on July 23rd. Um, and I also have a book signing in San Francisco in November, and copies of it will be able to be purchased there too at the Cartoon Art Museum on November 16th.
Fantastic. So, how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
You can go to my website. So I'm on johannamation.com, johannamation.com. I'm also on social media way more than I should be. I'm on I'm on Blue Sky. I have a Ko-fi page. I'm starting to post a lot more on Kara, which is an art curation platform similar to ArtStation. And I'm also on Instagram. All of those places, I'm Johannamation, same spelling. And I also have a newsletter via email that you can sign up for. And that's usually where I will post a lot of my announcements and a lot of things about what I'm up to, what I'm working on, things that are coming up, or just various musings about life and art. And I will always post a comic book recommendation in my newsletter, just hyping up a graphic novel or a comic that I read recently that I loved. And there will always be a cat tax. So you'll always get a little photo of Raven if you can't get
That's
enough cats in
wonderful.
your life.
Can't have enough cats.
Nope, nope, it's impossible.
Yep.
It's against the law to have too many cats in your life. You just can't be done.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, Johanna. It was wonderful speaking with you today,
Yeah.
and uh, and good luck with your graphic novel, Ghost Keeper.
Yeah, thank you so
And
much, Selena. I appreciate the opportunity to sit down and talk with Eddie's Bookstop of Worcester. This was really
yeah,
fun.
well, it's great. And if you ever get into the Worcester area, we'd love to have you come in.
Yeah, for sure. I would love an excuse to go to to go to Massachusetts. Is it near the Boston area?
About an hour
Okay.
from Boston. Yeah, we're in the kind of central Massachusetts.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
great.
Wow, I'll have to keep that in mind. That
Okay.
would be fun.
Well, thank you very much. And we will be speaking with you,
Awesome.
Johanna Taylor.
Thank you.